Good afternoon and welcome to the very first Australian Fungicide Resistance Extension Network, which is a mouthful, so we call it AFREN for short, webinar on fungicide resistance in South Australia. So my name is Kylie Ireland. I'm the Extension Coordinator for AFREN, and today I'll be facilitating the session. Before we get started, just some brief housekeeping. So everyone should be muted, and just please keep it on mute for the meanwhile. To ask a question, go to the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, click on it, open the window, enter your question, and then it will be posted ready to be answered. You can also tick to send anonymously if you don't want your name attached to the question. In the very unlikely event of a webinar hacking, the webinar will be immediately shut down and a new link will be sent to you within 10 minutes. And we just ask that you be kind as we move forward in this together. So just to give you some background on what AFREN is, I'll just go to the next slide. So basically, it's born of the recognition, the project. It's supported and initiated by the GRDC, and in the recognition that fungicide resistance is serious and it is increasingly prevalent in Australian grains crops. So our remit is to deliver regionally specific resources and training to help growers and advisors understand the status, the risks, and the management of fungicide resistant in Aussie grains. And to do that, we're going to develop and deliver a range of materials, including a fungicide resistance management guide, workshops, info sessions, and webinars such as today, and fact sheets, updates, and email alerts. And we're able to do this by harnessing the skills and expertise of a really wide range of people. So plant pathologists, fungicide resistance experts, comms and extension specialists across the country. And it's really important to get that regional component because these risks change across the country. So on the call today with us from the AFREN team, we have support from Lauren at Ag Communicators, making sure the Zoom components go smoothly. We have Wes Mayer and Fran Lopez Ruiz there, if they can wave, in the office at the Centre for Crop and Disease Management here in Perth, and they are specialists in fungicide resistance diagnostics and management in Australia. But our stars of the show today are Tara and Hugh, so Doctors Hugh Wallwork and Tara Garrard, and both of them are serial pathologists with SARDI. Hugh has more than 30 years experience at SARDI and a background in genetics from the UK. And for the past 12 or more years, he's been involved in tracking net form of net blotch virulence across the state, which makes him really uniquely qualified to assess and provide support when they did detect fungicide resistance in that pathogen population in the 2019 season. And Tara is also with SARDI. She's been there for 4 years and she's got a background in soil microbiology. And she said that while she's not from a farming background, she used to spend a lot of time at a friend's property down on the west coast of South Australia, which inspired her to get into ag. So she's been a good turn, and she's been working closely with Hugh for these past 2 years on the net form of net blotch, and now leads the cereal pathology group. So I will, without further ado, throw it to Tara and Hugh to tell us what the situation is in South Australia.
Thanks very much, Kylie. So we'll start off talking to you today about net form net blotch, which is one of the more recent developments in terms of fungicide resistance. Last year, Hugh and I got a call from an agronomist as a crop emerged and net form net blotch started to develop on it. So this crop was a barley crop. It had been barley the year before as well, Spartacus both years, and both years it had been treated with a full rate of Susceptibility. So last year the net form was developing in the canopy. We went out and had a look with the agronomist, Sam Holmes, and sent a sample to Fran and his team at CCDM. We had a chat to them as well about how much rain they'd had at the beginning of the season, because it's really important for there to have been enough rain for the sativa to be taken up into the plant and start having an effect. And it had, we got results back from Fran, and it did have a mutation and it was resistant to the fluxapyroxad. And you can see from the picture here, we've got some defoliated leaves at the bottom of the canopy, and the lesions of the net form net blotch are moving right up through the canopy. When we went back to visit later in the year, this is just the picture on the left here is that the emergence of flag leaf, and you can see that right up at the top of the canopy we're seeing lesions there as well. So whilst this had some follow-up sprays, once net form net blotch gets going, it can be really difficult to get it under control. So there were 3 paddocks like this from this grower down in the Minlaton region. All of them had an extensive amount of net form throughout the canopy, so we knew that there was going to be a lot of spores that were being produced from these paddocks. So the way that net form net blotch works is the spores that are developed on those lesions in the canopy, they can be carried through the wind and they can go quite a long way. So they were moving, we knew that they were likely to be moving around the Yorke Peninsula. So Fran and his team came down from Western Australia, and we did a tour of the Yorke Peninsula and conducted a survey so that we could get a better picture of what was actually happening. So in this survey, we started up north of Butte and went all the way down to the southern Yorke Peninsula where the original paddocks were found, south of Minlaton. And each one of these pie graphs represents a sample that was taken. So within that sample, there would have been a certain number of isolates that were collected, and you can see that here is the N number. And then the pie graph is split into how those isolates responded. So blue is sensitive, which means it's still responding to the fungicide. Orange is reduced sensitivity, meaning that we're starting to see it not work so well. And you can see the threshold there is 5 micrograms per milliliter. And red is resistant, meaning that it's no longer working at all. So the orange and basically, and you can see up in the northern part of the Yorke Peninsula, we have these pie graphs that are all blue. So they're still sensitive, they're still responding to the fungicide. As we start to move down the Yorke initial paddocks that we found, you can see a lot more red and orange creeping into these pie graphs. So that's indicating that here's our hottest paddock here, where we've got 58% of that net form net blotch population is resistant and 13% that have got reduced sensitivity. So we can see that that's spread around the bottom of the Yorke Peninsula there. The other testing that was done from these samples was on DMIs, and tebuconazole was used as the DMI in this assay. The pie graphs are set up in the same way, where you've got sensitive, reduced sensitivity and resistant. And you can see from this graph, we've got quite a lot of samples all over the Yorke Peninsula that are resistant or have reduced sensitivity. And we've got a few different mutations that have occurred there. So that was a bit of a surprise. At this stage, those results are just for tebuconazole only, and they're kind of used as an indicator for how the DMIs are going and where they're sitting. So yeah, we were not aware that this was happening. Now we're aware, and we need to be including that in how we manage things going forward. So 20% of all of those isolates showed at least reduced sensitivity to both tebuconazole and to fluxapyroxad. And 4.2% of all of those isolates were highly resistant to both the tebuconazole and the fluxapyroxad. So yeah, that was quite concerning for us. We needed to move on how we were going to start managing this. Once we started putting out some extension messages around what we're seeing on the Yorke Peninsula, we did receive a couple of other samples from around the state. So one of those was from Kyvie Bolite in the southeast of South Australia. They had a paddock there of Oxford barley. It had had a full rate of Susceptibility on it, and they were really struggling to control the net form net blotch within that. They sent a sample in and to Fran's team in CCDM, and it came back with reduced sensitivity to the SDHI. So you can see in the picture here on the right hand side, we've got defoliated leaves sitting around the bottom, and that's moving right up into the canopy where we've got these really nasty lesions up higher up. So even though it's reduced sensitivity, you can still see the actual control there is not sufficient. Then on the Eyre Peninsula, over in Lock, there was an area over there where they noticed things were not working quite as well as they expected, and they sent samples off to Fran and his team again, and this also came back with reduced sensitivity to the SDHI. So these, my understanding is these are separate mutations to what we're seeing on the Yorke Peninsula. So we're expecting that the spores would have been blowing around over the Yorke Peninsula. We didn't really know where they would have gone. If these are separate mutations, that's suggesting that they're separate occurrences of reduced sensitivity. At the beginning of this year in Port Kenny, there's a hot spot coming up in a Susceptibility treated paddock, which is currently under investigation. So we've just sent samples across to CCDM to have a look at that. But that's another potential area. So I'll talk a little bit now about net form net blotch and how that pathogen population works and why that's so important to what we're doing here. Net form net blotch is a sexually reproducing pathogen, which means it doesn't have one or two different pathotypes. Every single isolate that you take of net form net blotch is going to be and we've been tracking that, well, Hugh's been tracking that in the serial pathology group for about 12 years. I've used the 2018 data here as a bit of an example. So what you can see down the left-hand side is we've got 24 different lines or cultivars that we run this screening against. And then along the top, we have the different isolates of net form net blotch that we're looking at. And you'll see the host, so which cultivar they've come from and the area that they've come from. So you can see across the top here, we've got a series of cultivars that seem to consistently show resistance. So green and yellow, these lower numbers indicate resistance, and the reds and purples indicate susceptibility. Those oranges are the intermediates. Some of our more commonly grown varieties, Compass, Planet and Spartacus, you can see when you compare across the isolates, there's definitely susceptibility there. We've got some variation, it depends on what isolate that you use, what region you're in. Quite dependent. Spartacus, you can see, did have some isolates that were quite resistant, as well as some that were showing susceptibility. You can also see Fleet and Maritime. Back before my time, Maritime was a very commonly grown variety. It had good resistance to net form net blotch, but there was only one major gene that was holding that up. When that broke down, it became a highly susceptible variety, and the net form net blotch was really bad. That's now no longer grown. And what we see in the pathogen population now is that that virulence has basically entirely dropped out of our pathogen population. And if you looked just at this data set, you would think that Maritime is a resistant cultivar. But that's not the case. It's just no longer grown, and so we don't see that isolate floating around anymore. We took a series of isolates from around the Minlaton area and the bottom of the Yorke Peninsula where we did the survey last year, and this is the results of them here. You can see we've got isolates from Minlaton, Urania, Pine Point, a series of different cultivars, but quite a few of them have come across Spartacus. Spartacus was really commonly grown on the Yorke Peninsula last year. If you have a look at what's happening in Spartacus here, you can see that we've got 9s, 7s, 9s, 8s. So this is now susceptible or very susceptible. What we're seeing is the pathogen has shifted to adapt to the Spartacus that's so commonly grown in that area, and it's really well adapted to it. So just to recap on that, net form net blotch, it's a sexually reproducing population. The virulence is highly variable and it's rapidly evolving. When you remove a selection pressure, that virulence can very quickly be dropped out of the population. So we're hoping that resistance to fungicides in net form net blotch are likely to show similar variability as the virulence. So if we stop having Susceptiva used so commonly in the rotation, then the virulence that is resistant to that would start to drop away. So on the Yorke Peninsula in 2020, we're hoping there's been some changes in varieties and also in fungicide regimes. And we're hoping that this will reduce the incidence of the fungicide resistance in 2021. So throughout 2020, we'll be conducting a survey, and we're hoping from that we've got a sound evidence-based strategy that we can put out for 2021. So keep an eye on what's happening in your paddocks and share that with us. Feel free to send us samples. We'd be really happy to see them. So fungicide resistance, what's the risk? Basically, the higher disease pressure that you've got, the higher the chance of having fungicide resistance. So the risk of the fungicide resistance is the greatest when the pathogen has a short latency period, sexually reproducing, and high level of spore production. So if you're working with something that can produce spores really quickly, has a high amount of genetic diversity in those spores, and can produce a high number of those spores, then you're the most at risk. So also using a single mode of action in your fungicides puts you at high risk, and having a susceptible variety. So susceptibility and resistance in pathogens, it's not a linear scale. If you're working from resistant up to susceptible, it's not just linear. Once you move towards that susceptible end, it starts to look a little bit more like an exponential graph. So your difference between an MS, an S, and a VS is quite different. And the spore production load is going to be quite different between those as well. So good agronomic practice and selection of less susceptible varieties can reduce your risk considerably. So I'll talk a little bit now about what happens with this fungicide resistance. A single step mutation means you're moving from a susceptible sensitive across to resistant with one change. So the group 11 fungicides function in this way. You can also have a multi-step, which is where you have a progressive change moving from sensitive through to resistant. And the group 3 fungicides function in this way. So basically for group 11s, you can go from sensitive to resistant in one change, whereas in say the group 3s, you can go from sensitive to resistant in a stepwise change where you're getting reduced sensitivity as those changes are accumulating. So the types of mechanisms that you can have a target site mutation, a target site overexpression, increased copy number of the target gene, detoxification of the fungicide, exclusion or expulsion of the fungicide. So we're seeing a target site mutation and a target site overexpression in our group 3 fungicides in the net blotches in South Australia. So how can we look at managing our chemicals to work with this or to try and avoid this? Only spraying if necessary. So only spraying when we've actually got disease in the paddock. Choosing mixtures that have got different modes of action if they're available. never applying the same group 3 fungicide twice in a row, trying to alternate our sprays. Group 7 and 11 fungicides, seed dressing and foliar. So we need to remember our seed dressing in part of our fungicide strategy here. Shouldn't be used more than once per season. So if you're using an SDHI on the seed, you shouldn't be putting an SDHI out as a foliar spray later that year. And using fungicides before we have a wide level of infection. So when we have that really high spore load where the disease is really going, if we're spraying then, we would like to avoid that if possible. And don't compromise effective control. Stay within your label rates and monitor and test your samples. So fungicide is only one part of the triangle really, and we've talked about how we can manage and use those fungicides. But it's really important to remember our non-chemical IDM strategies as well. So our crop rotations, managing the green bridge, stubble management, and sowing later. So you're not going to have all of these options available to you every year, and you've got to adapt to what's going to work within your farming system. But any of these that you can adapt, you can help to manage this. So for example, if you've had a really high load of net blotch in your barley in the previous year, probably not a good idea to sow barley in a susceptible variety straight back into that stubble. And your variety selection, so we've talked a little bit about this. So where possible, selecting a resistant or less susceptible variety and reducing your reliance on fungicides throughout the growing season. And just a little reminder about managing your green bridges. Hugh and I were out doing some crop monitoring last week and we came across this paddock. It was a lentil paddock, and you can see the volunteer barley in that paddock has been growing for quite a while. Obviously no fungicide on the barley, and you can see the net blotch is really getting going. So because of the range that those spores can move, that's going to be having an impact on the barley crop you might have next door that you're trying to control. So just one to keep in mind. And that's all from me for the minute. I'll pass over to Hugh.
And just before Hugh gets going, just please, if you've got any questions, send them through on the Q&A or the chat so that we have a record of those. We'd really like to encourage you to do that. So off we go, Hugh.
Okay, so I'm just going to cover the other diseases. Tara's done a good job on the net blotch. Weak powdery mildew is the other one that's been causing a bit of excitement last year. The thing about this disease, look at the photograph carefully, you can see all that mildew on those lower stems in the canopy there. That indicates that you've really got to get control, you've really got to spray before canopy closure to try and get the fungicide down on those lower stems. Because if you don't, then when the heads come out late in the season, you're quite likely under any humid conditions to get powdery mildew into those heads where it's really hard to get any chemical to control it. So that's been building up as a problem. And so the farmers in that area have been going out there, putting their fungicides on to try and control it. But yeah, we discovered, or Fran discovered from samples he got sent to him from that region, that there's resistance developing those crops, so fungicides weren't working, and they've discovered a complete resistance to strobilurins, also reduced sensitivity to DMIs, tebuconazole from those samples. I've written authored there, but actually it was Butte. I was changing that in an earlier slide. But Alford is actually the site where we saw very severe powdery mildew last year, and it got stuck into the chief variety there, and we've been using that sample in subsequent tests for powdery mildew. So the real reason they're getting a problem there is they are having close rotations, a lot of wheat in close rotation, the infected stubbles are there all the time, so the powdery mildew survives in a sexual form on that stubble, ready to reinfect the next year. And unfortunately, all the varieties just about, or most of the varieties, are susceptible to very susceptible. Just put here a list of the common varieties or earlier varieties that are grown in that area. And as you can see, the S to VS predominates. Certainly the varieties that growers have been looking at have been Septa, and Chief, the two main ones, and they're both S to VS. And as Tara said, once you start getting that VS category, the amount of spore production coming off those plants will be enormous. So they've been growing things that are highly susceptible. And not only have we, as a result of that, been seeing resistance to the fungicides, but we've also been seeing changes in the virulence to some degree, because prior to this, Chief had been coming up as being moderately resistant. Similarly, the variety Rockstar before had been moderately resistant, but certainly in that area now we're seeing this virulence on these varieties. So a lot of that susceptibility is coming from the wild Catcham family, which are causing a problem. Previous to those varieties, mace was very widely grown. As you can see, that's a little bit more resistant, MS to S, and by and large, the MS category keeps you out of trouble in most cases. It's when you get down to the S to the S, you get the major problem. Moving on to powdery mildew and barley, a lot of you will know there's been a lot of problem with resistant to fungicide powdery mildew in Western Australia. Fran and his group have also detected it in Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania. As far as I know, it hasn't been detected in South Australia, but the main reason for that is the actual levels of powdery mildew in South Australia are extremely low due to very widespread and frequent treatments very widespread treatment of seed for the last 20, 30 years. So because almost everybody else is using a seed treatment for their powdery mildew, the inoculum levels are being kept extremely low, and without any inoculum, you can't get mutations developing to cause a problem. This can, of course, change very quickly if some of the mildew from the other regions were to come in, and then the common seed treatments we're currently relying on will suddenly become ineffective. So we could see this change quickly, but at the moment it's working magnificently for us. And so we strongly recommend that all farmers keep treating seed of the varieties, all varieties basically, to maintain this advantage going forward. Moving on to Septoria Tritici Blotch, this is a slide from Andrew Milgate, who had the project looking at fungicide resistance in Septoria. This is just a graphic from a survey he ran in 2017, and it shows a wide distribution of the CYP51 mutation, which has led to some significant loss of sensitivity into some of the DMIs. It's notable that there haven't been any changes to this date, as far as we know, to the strobilurins or SDHIs. Certainly overseas, though, we have had strobilurins completely useless in the UK. So we're partway down the track to having a problem. The slight problem here, of course, is that we don't have any updated information on Septoria, and we're hoping that this gap will be filled by GRC in due course, so we can monitor this going forward. The data from those isolates which have lost some of their sensitivity suggests that triadimenol is not effective, that propiconazole, tebuconazole, flutriafol, and ciproconazole have reduced effectiveness, but the other ones above are still effective. Again, this is slightly outdated information now, but that's the latest data we have, that there will be reduced effectiveness of some of those products, but as far as we know, the others are still fully effective. In Western Australia, they've got a different spectrum of resistances to the DMIs in the net form and spot form net blotch. Some of those spots are a little bit hard to see on the map there, but they've certainly got resistance to both spot form and net form across WA to different degrees in different areas. So they're getting a wider range of resistances to DMI, and more information than we've got here at this stage. We're hoping we can fill on that more this year. Looking at other diseases, one of the really good news stories is that rusts basically don't seem to suffer from loss of resistance, loss of efficacy in the fungicides. It's not been detected anywhere. The one exception I'm aware of is apparently soybeans in Brazil are now got reduced sensitivity to fungicides, so that it can happen. It's not unusual that the rust may break down one day, but at the moment they're pretty safe bet. There has been loss of efficacy for scald in Europe and New Zealand, so that's a bit of a moderate risk. And eye spot, there's certainly resistance to fungicides in eye spot in the UK, in closely related species. So that's also a low risk. Having said that, management of all these three diseases will impact on the problems of managing fungicide resistance in other diseases. So you've got to actually be careful of what you use in controlling both the rust, eye spot and scald, so that you're not impairing your effective long-term management of the diseases where we do have resistance to fungicides. So you've got to look at all diseases in your management strategy, not just the one you focus on at that particular time. And here's a slide that Tara showed earlier, just slightly reworded. Again, all these diseases, the same rules basically apply. You've got to limit the applications, only apply it if necessary, but certainly do it early if you're going to need to do it early to get good control. Choose mixtures, hopefully with different modes of action. Alternate the sprays. Don't just keep using the same group 3 one twice. Only use group 7 and 11 fungicides once. A caveat on that is that on the Yorke Peninsula, we have been saying we shouldn't be using any of the fluxapyroxad SDHIs for the Yorke Peninsula this year, because we really want to try and reduce the widespread nature and the of that resistance. We hope we can remove a lot of that virulence or resistance for coming years. We need to monitor that one. Fungicides, where they're going to be used, should be used early, preferably before canopy closure. All these diseases with problems with fungicide resistance tend to predominate down the low in the canopy, and once the canopy closure happens, it can be very hard to get on top of the problem. Stay within label rates and consider all pathogens when planning a fungicide strategy. And just like to thank Sam for his help with work on the lower Yorke Peninsula, Mark Battenauer Group and Fran Lopez and his whole team in CCDM for all the great work they've been doing.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that, Tara and Hugh. We are open for questions. I'll just check the chats and see what we've got. I've got one question come through. Just wondering, is there a need to manage fungicide resistance on a regional basis, or can you just worry about your paddock?
Sorry.
Sure, good.
I think it's pretty important that it's regional. I think just looking at the way that the net blotch disease moves, that pathogen can move quite far in the wind. What you're doing in your paddock is only one piece of the puzzle. It's going to move around. So it's really important that it's regional or larger approaches.
And that's the same as the rust diseases, really, where they are seen as community diseases. If one farmer's been careless and not controlling it on his farm, doing the right thing, then that's going to impact on everybody downwind. These spores certainly can go long distances. And by the time you've got a problem, it's usually been there for a year or two. We're certain that problem on the lower Yorke Peninsula would have been there probably for 2 years. To be that widespread last year, it must have been there a year or two earlier. And we fully expect spores from those paddocks to have spread and be causing minor problems or issues elsewhere that people are not yet aware of. So it is a community type disease, and you have to really be aware of what's happening on a wider scale.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that. Another question is, I guess, you know, we know that there's really only 3 groups of fungicides that we really have in cereals, and just wondering if there's any new products coming onto the market that might help us manage fungicide resistance more effectively. So, yeah.
We know that Nick Poole is in the audience, so perhaps you could pass that on to Nick.
On to Nick. Yeah, I don't know if Nick has can speak to that if he wants to. I know that Fran has some background in that as well. So Fran, do you want to take a spin at that, and Nick can correct us if he wants?
Yeah, I'll try to add something to that. But I'm sure that others will have information on this as well. There are certainly products that will be developed that are actually currently being developed by the chemical industries and probably will be hitting the market, not actually far away from where we are at the moment. The problem is that the majority of those compounds, as far as I know, they belong to the same chemical groups we've got at the moment. So the 3 main groups, right? I think it will be fantastic if at some point we could introduce something radically different, like a multi-site. And I know that, you know, multi-sites are not silver bullets, they come with their own issues, but instead, in terms of resetting the whole system back to zero, right, they are fantastic, right? We're currently running a management trial together with Nick Bull and some homes in the Yorke Peninsula. And we've got heaps of different products in that management trial. One of the compounds that we've got there is a multi-site. So, you know, results on this management trial will probably provide some support to the potential registration of some of these compounds if that's something that is on the cards. There is at least a new mode of action that is being developed by one of the chemical companies. I don't know if that mode of action is going to be made available for the controlled net blotches, but you know, it will be fantastic as well. But at the end of the day, we have to try, as Tara and Hugh have been saying before, we have to try to play with the tools that we've got at the moment and minimize the spread of resistance further. So we've got heaps of different tools available, believe it or not. Fungicides is just, as Tara was saying before, just the tip of that pyramid. And we've got really, really good tools behind fungicides. The more we use these tools before we get to fungicides, the lower the chances of fungicide resistance being developed or for fungicides that keep spreading. So just summarizing, we probably are not going to see new compounds in the short term. If we see some, that would be fantastic. But just keep emphasizing the use of all those other management tools that we've got available.
Cool, good advice there, Fran. Thanks for that. And probably the final question we've got here is, how does fungicide resistance differ from herbicide resistance? So did you want to take that one, Hugh or Tara?
The main difference, I guess, from my perspective, is that herbicide resistance is very much managed within a paddock. It's very related to what's happened in that one paddock. Whereas fungicide resistance, with the spores going large distances, is more of a community, a region-wide problem. Obviously, with herbicide resistance, you've got problems of the seed being retained in that paddock and then getting the seed bank being a big problem. With fungicides, you know, it's resistance. You don't have that problem, but we do have other control levers, like we've got varieties that can help to reduce the problem. Hopefully we'll get more varieties of better resistance, but as you have seen from the charts that Tara was talking to, we think we got something better, but over time, if that variety gets overused, then resistance builds up to that variety. There are some varieties which appear more stable. There are others which are very unstable. And I think one of the things that maybe didn't come up is that just like rotating fungicides is important, it's also good to actually mix varieties in a landscape. So last year there was pretty well wall-to-wall Spartacus. There really needs to be a bigger diversity of varieties, and not simply the name of a variety, because some of those varieties are very similar to each other. You need to have a diversity of pedigrees in that landscape. Certainly with powdery mildew up in the northern peninsula with the wheat, all those really susceptible ones, most of them are all closely related to the old wild catchum. They've all got that wild catchum level susceptibility. And simply replacing Spartacus with, say, Maximus it may give you a temporary advantage, because Maximus at the moment is slightly better, but it's going down at the same sort of speed. So we need to have a diversity of genotypes out there, and that's where we're going to rely on breeding programs, putting this as a priority, and growers being prepared to grow things that maybe not as optimum, but just provides diversity.